Rubber began not in a factory or a laboratory, but deep inside the trunk of a tropical tree that indigenous peoples of the Amazon basin had been quietly exploiting for thousands of years before any European ever laid eyes on it. Long before the word rubber existed in any language, the Olmec, Maya, and later the Aztec civilizations of Mesoamerica had already discovered something extraordinary. A milky white liquid that oozed from certain trees when cut, and that, once dried, transformed into a strange, bouncy, water-resistant solid unlike anything else in the natural world. That substance would eventually reshape global trade, ignite an industrial revolution, and leave behind a trail of extraordinary innovation intertwined with horrific human suffering. The story starts roughly 3,600 years ago in the humid lowlands of what is now southern Mexico and Central America. The Olmec people, one of the earliest complex civilizations in the Americas, discovered that the sap of the Castilla elastica tree, when mixed with juice extracted from morning glory vines, produced a moldable, elastic material with properties that seemed almost magical. The Olmec word for this sticky white sap was cahuchu, which loosely translates to weeping wood, a poetic description of how the tree appeared to cry white tears when its bark was slashed. Archaeologists have unearthed rubber balls at Olmec sites dating back to around 1,600 years before the Common Era, proof that this civilization had already mastered the chemistry of natural latex thousands of years before Charles Goodyear was even born. The Mesoamerican peoples did not simply collect this sap and use it raw. They processed it, understanding intuitively that pure latex alone was too sticky and too unstable for practical use. By blending the tree sap with the acidic juice of morning glory vines, they triggered a rudimentary vulcanization process, hardening and stabilizing the material centuries before European chemists would rediscover the same principle. This processed rubber became central to one of the most important cultural and religious practices in Mesoamerican civilization, the ball game. Played on massive stone courts throughout the Maya and Aztec worlds, this ritual sport used solid rubber balls that could weigh several pounds and bounce with startling force. The game carried deep religious significance, often ending in ceremonial sacrifice, and rubber balls were treated as sacred objects rather than mere sporting equipment. Rubber served far more practical purposes as well. Mesoamerican peoples used it to waterproof fabric, coat their feet for protection against wet ground, bind tools together, and even create rudimentary containers. The Aztec Empire, which dominated central Mexico by the time Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 1500s, demanded rubber as tribute from conquered territories, integrating it into an economic system that stretched across hundreds of miles. When Spanish explorers first witnessed indigenous peoples playing with these strange bouncing balls, they were baffled. European culture had never encountered anything like it. Nothing in the natural materials familiar to Europeans, wood, stone, metal, wool, behaved this way. It seemed to defy the physical rules Europeans understood. Yet despite this initial fascination, rubber remained a curiosity for nearly 3 centuries after European contact. Spanish colonizers were consumed by the pursuit of gold and silver, and the strange elastic sap of a tropical tree simply did not register as valuable by comparison. Samples occasionally made their way back to Europe as exotic souvenirs, objects of scientific curiosity rather than commercial interest. It would take the intervention of French scientific expeditions in the 1730s to finally bring rubber to serious European attention. In 1735, a French scientist named Charles-Marie de la Condamine sent to South America as part of a geodesic expedition to measure the shape of the Earth, encountered indigenous communities along the Amazon River who were extracting sap from a tree they called cahuchu, meaning weeping wood in the local Quechua language. This word would eventually evolve into the modern term caoutchouc, still used in French and several other European languages to describe natural rubber. La Condamine sent detailed reports and samples back to the French Academy of Sciences, describing how indigenous Amazonian tribes tapped rubber trees, collected the sap in gourds, and cured it over smoky fires to create waterproof boots, bottles, and other useful items. European scientists were intrigued, but for decades nobody quite knew what to do with the material. Raw natural rubber, as it existed straight from the tree, had a fatal flaw that limited its usefulness dramatically. In cold temperatures, it became stiff, brittle, and cracked easily. In hot temperatures, it turned soft, sticky, and would melt into a gooey, foul-smelling mess. A product that behaved like rock in winter and like tar in summer was interesting as a scientific novelty, but nearly useless for any serious commercial or industrial application. For roughly 100 years after European scientists first documented rubber, this fundamental instability kept it confined to a small niche of specialty products: waterproof fabric coatings, erasers, and the occasional novelty item. The erasers, in fact, gave rubber its English name. In 1770, the British scientist Joseph Priestley, already famous for his work isolating oxygen, discovered that small blocks of this South American sap could effectively erase pencil marks by rubbing them across paper. He called the material rubber, and the name stuck permanently in the English language, even as the substance itself remained largely marginal to industry and commerce for decades afterward. The 1820s and 1830s brought a wave of experimentation as European and American inventors tried desperately to solve rubber's temperature problem. A Scottish chemist named Charles Mackintosh developed a method of dissolving rubber in coal tar naphtha to create a waterproof coating for fabric, leading to the invention of the raincoat that still bears his name today. But Mackintosh's rubberized fabric still suffered from the same fundamental flaw. It grew stiff in cold weather and sticky in heat, limiting its practical use to mild climates and short-term wear. It was an American inventor, obsessive to the point of financial self-destruction, who had finally cracked the puzzle that had stumped chemists on 2 continents. Charles Goodyear was not a scientist by training. He was a failed hardware merchant from Connecticut who became utterly consumed by the challenge of stabilizing rubber after encountering a rubber life preserver that had cracked and rotted within months of purchase. Beginning in the 1830s, Goodyear threw himself into rubber experimentation with a single-minded intensity that destroyed his finances, his health, and nearly his family. He mixed rubber with everything he could get his hands on: magnesium, lime, nitric acid, even Italian cheese, according to some historical accounts, desperately searching for a formula that would make the material stable across a range of temperatures. Goodyear spent years in and out of debtor's prison, borrowing money from friends and family, pawning household goods, and at one point reportedly digging through garbage for materials to continue his experiments. His children later recalled going hungry because their father had spent the family's last coins on chemicals rather than food. Then, in 1839, according to Goodyear's own later account, he accidentally spilled a mixture of rubber and sulfur onto a hot stove. Rather than melting into a useless puddle as raw rubber would have done, the material charred slightly on the surface but remained flexible, elastic, and stable underneath. Goodyear had stumbled onto the process that would later be called vulcanization, combining rubber with sulfur under controlled heat to create molecular bonds that transformed the sap's unstable structure into something remarkably durable and temperature resistant. It took Goodyear several more years to refine and patent the process, finally securing an American patent in 1844. Around the same time, an English inventor named Thomas Hancock developed a strikingly similar sulfur-based process independently, and a bitter, prolonged legal battle over patent rights consumed both men for years afterward. Goodyear, despite giving his name to what would eventually become one of the largest rubber companies in the world, never personally profited from his discovery in any meaningful way. He died in 1860, still deeply in debt, having spent virtually every dollar he ever earned or borrowed chasing the secret of stable rubber. Vulcanization changed everything. Suddenly, rubber could maintain its elasticity across a wide range of temperatures, opening the door to an explosion of industrial applications that nobody had previously imagined possible. Rubber gaskets, hoses, and seals became essential components in the rapidly industrializing factories of Europe and North America. But it was a specific invention roughly 4 decades later that would transform rubber from an industrial curiosity into one of the most demanded raw materials on the entire planet: the pneumatic tire. In 1888, a Scottish veterinarian living in Belfast named John Boyd Dunlop grew frustrated watching his young son struggle to ride a tricycle over the bumpy cobblestone streets outside their home. Dunlop experimented with wrapping the tricycle's solid rubber wheels in an inflated rubber tube, creating a cushioned, air-filled tire that absorbed shock far more effectively than anything previously available. Dunlop patented his pneumatic tire, and within just a few years, bicycle manufacturers across Europe were racing to adopt the technology. When the automobile emerged as a viable form of transportation in the final years of the 1800s, pneumatic rubber tires became an absolute necessity, and global demand for raw rubber began climbing at a rate nobody in the industry had ever witnessed before. This demand created a problem of staggering proportions. Natural rubber, at the turn of the 20th century, came almost exclusively from wild rubber trees growing scattered throughout the Amazon rainforest, tapped by hand, one tree at a time, in an environment that made large-scale industrial harvesting extraordinarily difficult. As bicycle and then automobile and then industrial demand exploded, the price of raw rubber skyrocketed, and companies and colonial governments raced desperately to secure control over rubber-producing territories anywhere on Earth they could find them. This race would trigger one of the most horrifying chapters in the entire history of European colonialism. In 1885, at the Berlin Conference that carved up Africa among European powers, King Leopold II of Belgium was granted personal control over a vast territory in Central Africa that he named the Congo Free State. Leopold marketed his colonial project publicly as a humanitarian mission to civilize and Christianize the region, but privately, he was determined to extract every possible ounce of profit from the territory's natural resources, particularly its ivory, and, increasingly, its wild rubber vines. As global rubber demand surged in the 1890s, Leopold's colonial administration imposed brutal rubber quotas on Congolese villages, forcing men to disappear into the forest for weeks at a time to collect enough wild rubber sap to meet impossible targets. The methods used to enforce these quotas were monstrous. Colonial officials and their armed enforcers, known as the force publique, routinely took women and children hostage to guarantee that men would return with sufficient rubber. Villages that failed to meet their assigned quotas faced brutal reprisals, including mutilation, whipping, and mass killing. Soldiers were required to provide severed hands as proof that ammunition had been used against actual human targets rather than wasted or sold, leading to a horrifying practice where hands were collected as gruesome evidence, sometimes from people who were still alive when the mutilation occurred. Historians estimate that the population of the Congo Free State declined by roughly 10 million people between 1885 and 1908 through a combination of direct violence, starvation, disease, and demographic collapse caused by the sheer brutality of the rubber extraction system. International outrage eventually forced change. Journalists, missionaries, and activists, including the writer Mark Twain and the diplomat Roger Casement, publicized the horrors of Leopold's regime, and mounting global pressure eventually forced the Belgian government to strip Leopold of personal control over the territory in 1908. But the underlying economic pressure that had driven this atrocity, the world's insatiable and rapidly growing demand for rubber, did not disappear. It simply moved. A similar pattern of exploitation unfolded simultaneously across the Amazon basin during what became known as the rubber boom. Cities like Manaus in Brazil transformed almost overnight from remote jungle outposts into astonishingly wealthy urban centers, flush with rubber money. Manaus built an opera house imported piece by piece from Europe, complete with materials shipped across the Atlantic Ocean and then up the Amazon River. Rubber barons living in the city imported ice from Europe to cool their drinks in the tropical heat and sent their laundry across the ocean to be cleaned in Portugal, an almost incomprehensible display of wealth in the middle of the rainforest. Meanwhile, indigenous peoples and enslaved or indentured laborers working the rubber tapping operations that generated this wealth endured conditions of extreme brutality, disease, and death, trapped in systems of debt bondage that made escape functionally impossible. The wild rubber boom, however, contained the seeds of its own destruction, and this is where the story takes an unexpected geopolitical turn. In 1876, a British explorer and adventurer named Henry Wickham smuggled approximately 70,000 rubber tree seeds out of Brazil, in defiance of Brazilian export restrictions designed to protect the country's rubber monopoly. Wickham shipped these seeds to the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in London, where botanists successfully germinated a small percentage of them. The resulting seedlings were then transported to British colonial territories in Southeast Asia, primarily Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, and Malaya, which is now Malaysia. This single act of botanical smuggling would ultimately devastate the Brazilian and broader Amazonian rubber economy within just a few decades. Unlike the wild rubber trees scattered unpredictably throughout the dense Amazon rainforest, the rubber trees planted in Southeast Asia could be grown on organized, efficient plantations, with trees arranged in neat rows, tapped on regular schedules, and harvested at industrial scale. By the 1910s, Southeast Asian plantation rubber had become dramatically cheaper to produce than wild Amazonian rubber, and the global rubber industry shifted almost entirely to British and Dutch colonial plantations in Malaya, Ceylon, and the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. Manaus and the other boom cities of the Amazon collapsed into economic irrelevance almost as quickly as they had risen, their opulent opera houses left standing as strange monuments to a wealth that had evaporated within a single generation. Southeast Asian rubber plantations came to dominate global supply for the next several decades, and by the 1930s, the region was producing the overwhelming majority of the world's natural rubber. This concentration of supply in a relatively small geographic region would prove to be a critical, strategic vulnerability when global conflict erupted once again in the 1940s. When Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia in the opening months of 1942, seizing Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies in rapid succession, the Allied powers suddenly found themselves cut off from roughly 90% of the world's natural rubber supply. This was not a minor inconvenience. Rubber was absolutely essential to modern warfare, used in tires for military vehicles and aircraft, seals and gaskets for engines, insulation for electrical wiring, and countless other applications across every branch of the military. The United States, facing a rubber crisis of genuinely existential proportions, launched an emergency scientific and industrial mobilization on a scale that rivaled the Manhattan Project in urgency, if not in secrecy. American chemists and engineers raced to develop synthetic rubber that could replace the natural product cut off by Japanese conquest. Companies including Standard Oil, Goodyear, and DuPont worked in cooperation with the United States government to scale up production of styrene butadiene rubber, a synthetic compound that had actually been developed earlier but never produced at meaningful industrial volumes. The American government rationed civilian rubber use with extraordinary severity, banning the sale of new rubber tires to most civilians and even launching nationwide scrap rubber collection drives, asking American citizens to donate old tires, raincoats, garden hoses, and rubber shoes to be recycled into military equipment. Within roughly 2 years, American synthetic rubber production scaled from virtually nothing to more than 800,000 tons annually. A feat of wartime industrial mobilization that many historians consider just as critical to the Allied victory as any single battlefield achievement. This wartime crisis fundamentally and permanently altered the global rubber industry. Once chemists had proven that synthetic rubber could be manufactured reliably and at massive scale from petroleum byproducts, the world's total dependence on tropical rubber plantations was broken forever. Synthetic rubber never entirely replaced natural rubber. Certain applications, particularly aircraft tires and heavy machinery components, still require the specific molecular properties that only natural latex can provide. But it introduced a permanent second pillar into an industry that had once rested entirely on a single geographically vulnerable source. Today, the global rubber industry operates as a hybrid of these two parallel histories. Natural rubber, still tapped largely by hand from Hevea brasiliensis trees, the same species Henry Wickham smuggled out of Brazil more than a century ago, comes primarily from Thailand, Indonesia, and Vietnam, which together account for the overwhelming majority of global natural rubber production. Synthetic rubber, meanwhile, is manufactured from petroleum in massive chemical facilities across the United States, China, and Europe, entirely independent of tropical climate or geography. Together, natural and synthetic rubber production now exceeds 30 million metric tons annually, feeding an industry whose applications have expanded far beyond anything the ancient Olmec or 19th century inventors could have possibly imagined. The modern tire industry alone consumes more than half of all rubber produced worldwide, a direct descendant of John Boyd Dunlop's frustrated tinkering with his son's tricycle wheels back in 1888. Rubber gaskets, seals, and hoses remain absolutely essential to every internal combustion engine and industrial machine on the planet. Rubber gloves, condoms, and medical tubing depend on latex properties that synthetic alternatives still struggle to fully replicate. Rubber bands, erasers, shoe soles, conveyor belts, and thousands of other everyday products trace their existence back to that same white sap that Mesoamerican civilizations were processing more than 3,000 years before Charles Goodyear ever spilled his fateful mixture onto a hot stove. There is something remarkable and more than a little unsettling in tracing rubber's complete journey from sacred Olmec ball games to the horror of Leopold's Congo to the desperate wartime laboratories of 1942 America. A substance that indigenous peoples once treated with reverence, using it in religious rituals and games tied to cosmic belief systems, became one of the primary drivers of some of the worst atrocities in the history of colonialism, before ultimately becoming so thoroughly industrialized and normalized that most people today never think twice about the tires on their car or the soles of their shoes. The sap that once wept from trees deep in the Amazon has, in one form or another, touched nearly every aspect of modern life. And its history carries both the ingenuity of human innovation and the darkest capabilities of human greed within the very same story. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the history of rubber, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of this story surprised you the most. And make sure to like this video so more people can discover the incredible and often disturbing journey of the sap that changed the world.